Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peter Husey, Director of Strategic Deterrence Studies at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Power. And welcome to our Nuclear Deterrence Forum series. And we are very fortunate to have today Lieutenant General Richard Formica, U.S. Army retired, and Brigadier General Kenneth Todorov, U.S. Air Force retired, with us today. Lieutenant General Formica is currently the Vice President, Strategic Initiatives at Caliber Systems, a management consulting and digital transformation company which serves the defense, federal and civil, national security, and commercial markets. Prior to Caliber Systems, General Formica spent 36 years in the United States Army. His final assignment was Commanding General of U.S. Army Space and Missile Command and U.S. STRATCOM's Joint Functional Component Command for Integrated Missile Defense. Brigadier General Todorov is a Sector Vice President and General Manager at Northrop Grumman, where he has been heavily involved in their missile defense programs. He spent 30 years in the Air Force, and his last position was as Deputy Director of the Missile Defense Agency under the Office of the Secretary of Defense in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to start today's session by giving you both an opportunity to make a few opening remarks on the state of U.S. missile defense and future opportunities and threats in this domain. And let's start then with General Formica. Over to you, sir.
Well, good morning, everyone, and good morning, Peter and Kamala. Thank you for that introduction, Peter. And thank you and the Mitchell Institute for leading this series of discussions and for the opportunity that we have to speak with you this morning. It's always a pleasure to appear at these forums with Brigadier General retired Ken Todorov. I had the pleasure to address this group 3 times in uniform. And Ken and I have had the opportunity to do so together, we think now 4 previous times since we've retired from the military. So we're pleased to be back to discuss this important topic of missile defense. As Peter mentioned in the introduction, my last assignment was as Commanding General of U.S. Army Space and Missile Defense Command in Huntsville, Alabama, and as the Commander of U.S. Strategic Command's Joint Functional Component Command for Integrated Missile Defense. At SMDC, we were responsible to organize, man, equip, and train our space and global missile defense forces. And at JFCCIMD, we were responsible for integrating the operational capabilities of missile defense forces with U.S. Strategic Command, U.S. Northern Command, the other geographic combatant commands, and with the Missile Defense Agency, the material developer. So it's with that experience that I come to these discussions on missile defense. As I was preparing for this session, I took the opportunity to review the 3rd and final time that I spoke to this forum in uniform. It was on the 4th of June, 2013. After providing an update on the status and major activities of the 2 commands, I provided my thoughts on the topic of missile defense. Several themes from those remarks 7 years ago jumped out at me as I was reviewing them the other day. The focus on rogue threats, North Korea and Iran. The need for both capability and capacity, and the tension between the 2. Integrated air and missile defense. Persistent sensor coverage in depth. Offense-defense integration. Hypersonics and directed energy. Interoperability and joint training. Global missile defense and the defend the homeland, and the need to seamlessly integrate it with regional ballistic missile defense, requiring integrated command and control and sensor and data management. These themes are familiar to us. Some are now integral to our IAMD programs, while others are issues that we're still wrestling with today. I'd like to briefly pull the thread on the one that has stayed with me over the years, offense-defense integration, and I think Ken will address integrated command and control as he touches on JADC² and other topics in his remarks. From my perspective, we must continue to consider the requirements of missile defense and our response to those requirements within the context of offense-defense integration. We know that we will never have enough interceptors to stop all the incoming missiles. So if we're to be successful, we must consider missile defense within that context of the strategic implications of deterrence and with full consideration of our offensive capabilities and attack operations, as well as with passive defense. The integrating of offensive and defensive capability must be throughout the conduct of operations, like we did in planning to conduct counterfire operations during the Cold War. We knew then that we could never win a defensive-only counterfire fight against the Soviet Union. They simply had way too many artillery systems, and they could outrange our systems. No matter how good, how responsive, how well-trained, or how effective our counterfire systems were, there simply wouldn't be enough. So consistent with airland battle at the time, we developed tactics, techniques, and procedures to execute proactive counterfire, to take out or mitigate Soviet artillery systems before they could shoot our formations, and to continually attack their systems throughout the fight. How did we do that? Well, there were essentially 4 elements to this counterfire approach: rapid offensive maneuver, take out his eyes, deep attack with offensive fires, and finally, good old-fashioned counter-battery fire. So as I began to appreciate the missile defense challenge, I saw then the need for a parallel approach. And I realized shortly after that that our air defense artillery doctrine addressed the solution that I was now espousing with its 4 elements of air defense: attack operations, passive defense, command, control, communications, and intelligence activities, and then finally, active defense. Attack operations, the integration of offense with the defense, is more than just scud hunting, and it's not just going after launchers, but it's about reducing the suite of capabilities of their missile defense system. Launchers, to be sure, but command and control nodes, sensors, logistics facilities, etc. And it can't be just left of launch. As with our counterfire process, it must be in response to launch and to the right of launch, and throughout the conduct of operations. Now, I was very pleased to note that the Missile Defense Review of 2019 directly addresses this topic. And though I don't always agree with the way it addresses it, I'm pleased that it does. And I'm also pleased that current discussions on missile defense now are much more likely to include the topic of offense-defense integration. We've come a long way in that. And I credit the Missile Defense Review for bringing that discussion to the forefront. In the past, much of the missile defense discussion focused almost exclusively on active defense and missile defense systems. There is growing recognition that active defenses alone won't be enough, and that any substantive discussion on missile defense must be considered within this context of offense-defense integration. This is how we will first deter, then defend, and ultimately defeat the missile threats that we face. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and I look forward to the opportunity to answer questions.
Good. General Todorov, over to you, sir.
Yeah, hey, Peter. Hey, everybody. First of all, thanks for having us back. As General Formica said, it's, I think, our 5th year now, and that's out of uniform. We both addressed this forum while we were still in uniform. I'm going to go back to the future a little bit, too, in my opening remarks here, but I wanted to thank you and the Mitchell Institute for having us. It's always a great opportunity. Different forum this year, of course. We're all getting used to some different things, and we had to. One of the really nice things about the differences in this forum is that I know there's a lot of people on the line that wouldn't normally be able to join us in our regular venue that are on today. A lot of really dear friends that I see out there and that have joined from both my professional life in uniform and out of uniform. So it's great that you've taken the time this morning to join us for this conversation. I hope that you'll get something out of it. It's certainly a topic that I think I'm passionate about. I know General Formica is, and I want to tip my cap to General Formica, who's been a dear friend and a mentor for ever since I've known him. And credit to him for really one of the first people to really talk about offensive defensive integration in the context of missile defense. He's really been on that message consistently from the last years he served in uniform and now for the years that he's been out of the military. And as he said, it's gaining some traction. The conversation does often go back to that offensive defensive integration piece, which is so vitally important, because for the subject of this forum, for deterrence and for missile defense, you can't think about missile defense in a vacuum. It can't only be in its own stovepipe. You've got to think about it in this continuum of capability for the warfighter. And I think that's something that General Formica has been hitting very hard for the last 8 years, and it is taking traction. We were pleased to see in the review, in the policy last year, that it actually started to take hold. So for the 5 years that I've been speaking out of uniform at this forum, you know, as I think back to those 5 years and the couple of years that preceded it, I'm amazed at how increasingly complex this environment has gotten. And General Formica hit on a couple of those themes. And, you know, it used to be a conversation strictly about long-range ballistic missile defenses. And then you think what's happened in the last 5 years, and you think to the advances in hypersonic threats, you think to what happened with Saudi Aramco last year with unmanned systems attacking an oil field and causing some very heavily strategic damage to their infrastructure, to their economy. That was done with relatively low-cost weaponry and systems, and it becomes a big problem for us and our friends and allies and partners around the world. And the environment is getting increasingly more complex. You couple that with, I think, the realities of where we are from a budgetary standpoint, from the realities of our nation and how we will be able to afford missile defenses and an offensive-defensive integration in the future. There are going to be some really, really tough decisions that need to be made in the environment of missile defense to keep our nation sort of on par with particularly our peer competitors, because we're fighting, hopefully not, but if we have to, we'll be fighting a mirror image of ourselves largely. And that's not what the missile defenses of the past have been preparing us to do. So we got to take that seriously and take that into account. Since this is an AFA and a Mitchell-sponsored event, I want to focus a little more today on air and missile defense, particularly integrated air and missile defense. And I said I was going to go back to the future a little bit. I too looked at my remarks the last time I spoke to this forum in uniform. I was then serving as the director of JIAMDO on the Joint Staff. That's the Joint Integrated Air and Missile Defense Organization. It's a mouthful, but it was a really worthwhile organization. I was on my way to the Missile Defense Agency, MDA, and I really had, I focused that day back in 2014, I think it was, on a publication that then Chairman Marty Dempsey had put out, the chairman's vision for integrated air and missile defense in the year 2020. Well, here we are in the year 2020. It looks nothing like what we thought it was going to look like back then. When you might think, well, why are you going back, Ken, to a document 5, 6 years ago? I'm often really struck at how relevant that document still is. Not that it had it exactly right, but it talked about things like offensive-defensive integration. We're still getting there. It talked about things like not only active defenses, but also passive defenses. We still have a ways to go there. It talked about kinetic and non-kinetic. We are still almost exclusively focused, in my opinion, on kinetic missile defenses. We've got to get away from that. It's simply not affordable from a strategic or from a budgetary standpoint. We've got to have different capabilities out there, directed energy, electronic warfare and attack. There's a myriad of things that we can bring to bear as a nation on to sort of beef up our missile defense toolkit. We haven't gotten there yet. And it talked about, the vision talked about melding all of these capabilities into a joint and combined capable force that would prevent an adversary from effectively employing its missile and air weapons. We have made significant progress in the 5 years, but we have much left to do as a nation, in my opinion. And there's a lot of talk, and I'm going to talk more today, I think, as we continue this conversation about how do we knit all of those things together? How do we take those capabilities? I'm not going to throw any of them away because they're all useful and viable. We spent a lot of precious resources developing them, and they're still very much a part of the warfighter's toolkit. But how do we better link them? How do we integrate them better? How do we come up with ways to seamlessly allow Navy platforms to work with long-range strike, to work with Army fires, et cetera, et cetera? We're still not there yet. And so there's a lot of buzz and a lot of talk about integration. There's about, if you ask 1,000 people, you'll get about 1,000 different definitions about what that truly means. We've got to get to the crux of that. There's a lot of talk, and I'm glad to hear the chiefs talking and the COCOMs talking about JADC2, Joint All-Domain Command and Control. There's a realization now that we've got to get at this problem. But I think given the environment has changed so much in the last few years, given that we're looking increasingly at the potential of competition with a peer competitor, a mirror image of ourselves, we really got to be smarter about how we knit these missile defense capabilities. And so, Peter, that's what I want to focus today on. How do we do that? What's this integration thing all about? What's this JAD thing, C2 thing about? Of course, in the course of the dialogue, we'll talk about the more strategic missile defenses as well, but I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much for General Todorov. I appreciate that. And General Formica, let me start with question number one. You both have spoken about in the past about the critical importance of maintaining a strong consensus on how to move forward on missile defense, both with respect to CONUS systems defending America, as well as our allies around the world and our military installations. Last year, DoD's Missile Defense Review set the sight for the overall picture for moving forward. But given events and following the MDR's guidance, how has the missile defense enterprise changed in the past year? And what is the general state of play in missile defense and its systems now as we go into a new administration? First, I'm going to let General Formica address that, and then over to you, General Todorov.
Okay, Peter, thank you. As you said in the question, there is a broad consensus on the need for missile defense, and that remains true. That's a good thing. I'm reminded of shortly after I took command of SMDC, General O'Reilly, who was then the director of the Missile Defense Agency, and I were preparing to testify before the Senate Armed Services, the Strategic Forces Subcommittee. And he commented, I remember vividly, he commented to me at the time that as we were getting ready to testify, we were doing so in an environment where the need for missile defense had become much more bipartisan. In his earlier testimonies that he did before I took command, it wasn't that way. And he was used to a much more bipartisan approach that didn't always make it comfortable for those of us testifying. But I was fortunate enough to have come in at the time where there was a bipartisan consensus towards missile defense. So there wasn't as much a discussion on whether, but how and how much. And I think that continues to be the discussions that we'll have going forward. I benefited from the Missile Defense Review of 2010 that was clear in its articulation. And one of the features that I continue to refer to is it established 10 missile defense priorities. And I think the establishment of those priorities helped coalesce discussions going forward. So we now have the Missile Defense Review of 2019. It's been generally reviewed and accepted as a good document. It clearly lays out the threat. It raises the discussion of the threat, particularly as it pertains to Russia and China and their evolution of regional missile threat. It lays out the principles and a very solid approach for missile defense. And to my liking, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, it strongly advocates for offense-defense integration, though, as I said, I don't always agree with the context in which it uses it. But nonetheless, I think it's a really strong document and has done that, both in addressing the threat and the challenges we face and the needed capabilities that we must have in order to counter those threats. And then I would say, Peter, one of the advantages that the Missile Defense Review of 2019 offers, and that I would suggest moving forward as a new administration considers how it's going to attack this problem, one of the strengths that we've had is the nesting of the national documents, the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, the National Military Strategy, and the Missile Defense Review. They're neatly nested. And that nesting, together with a clear articulation of priorities, is important as we move forward. And I would commend that to future reviews. Taken together, both the nesting of the national documents with whatever Missile Defense Review comes forward, and a clear articulation of priorities, that's what's needed to avoid confusion, provide clarity in approach, and enable efficient programming.
General Todorov.
Yeah, General Formica hit on some really good points. So rather than just sort of repeat what he said, let me take the question from a little bit of a different angle, and I'll go back to maybe where I opened with. It's over the past year, I'm really heartened to hear this conversation going on amongst the services about integration. You know, the Air Force has its ABMS. The Army is looking closely. It's a Project Convergence. The Navy in Project Overmatch, right? So all of the services kind of have this realization that they need to put renewed emphasis and new emphasis in many cases on this idea of integration. The recommendation I might pose for the future is that it's great that they're all doing that, but they're all still doing it in their own best interest. And while there's some, and the chiefs are talking to each other and there's cooperation and in convergence and overmatch and ABMS, they are experimenting together. Really the focus, as you would imagine, as it should be and as it always has been and will be, the services are focused on their own equities first. So I really think we need to consider the idea, and others have put this idea forth as well, of some kind of an integration lead for the department. I know that adds potentially more bureaucracy. You need to give someone the hammer and the budget to, frankly, to force the requirements together amongst the different equities here to really enforce this integration idea. And there's, again, been a lot of talk. You asked what's changed in the last year. There's been a lot of really good dialogue there. I think we have a ways to go there. And I think someone who would lead the architecture, because it has to be an architecture-first mindset in order to be successful. We can't just talk about systems of each of the services and trying to clunkily link them together. You've got to talk about an architectural framework for which they can all work and operate and work well together. And so someone that has sort of the hammer, as I say, and the budget and the authorities somewhere within the department, I think would be a very worthwhile consideration to do. The second thing I want to touch on, and over the last year, Peter, I think there's been a lot of talk about the next generation interceptor, or the NGI. And as you know, Congress is supporting the development of the NGI, which envisions a missile defense system specifically to counter those longer range threats. I think it's necessary. I think we should be pursuing as a nation the next generation interceptor. It is really sort of the next leap forward. The ground-based mid-course defense system is a very viable system. We spent a lot of treasure as a nation and time and blood and sweat equity making that system what it is today, which I think is a very effective system against basic ICBM threats from a rogue nation. But I think we can take it a step further, and I think we have to with NGI, or Next Generation Interceptor. A GMD, it's not to say that we're going to discard it. Again, it's going to remain sort of a viable part of the larger missile defense equation. But I think NGI, as time has come, the existing system is sort of a unitary solution. I think the Next Generation Interceptor will bring a multiple kill vehicle tip, which, as you know, for a lot of reasons is a good idea. And I think the technology is there to bring that to the fore. I think the solution that we have today is good, but some would call it sort of an 85% solution, not providing the essential benefits of addressing some of the more advanced threats, countermeasures, advanced reentry vehicles, et cetera. And so NGI is a leap forward in technology, going to provide a new capability to Homeland defense, and GMD will continue to augment it, but I think the NGI's time has come, and I hope that consideration for the future that the new administration and others will continue to support that initiative.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to General Formica.
Peter, before we go on, yeah. Can I just offer a comment to something Ken talked about?
Of course you can, sir.
Yeah, thanks. If you, in my opening remarks, when I identified some of the themes from 2013, and one of the topics that I've talked about in this forum before is the what I called the four tensions. One of those tensions was the tension between increased capability of current systems, increased capacity of current systems versus the investment in future capability. And when Ken brings up NGI, and as we start to look at priorities and funding over the short, mid, and long term, this perfectly exemplifies that tension, right? Back then, when I was talking in 2013, it was the tension between CE1 and CE2s, right? And then what was going to be next in the investment. But now as we invest, and rightly so, in NGI, recognizing that it doesn't deliver in the near term, right? There's this period of time in between when, as Ken says, you you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You've got to continue to maintain your legacy system, right? You got to continue to invest in it. You've got to continue to make improvements in that system so that you have capability that continues to be valid between now and when we deliver NGI. So I think it's a perfect example of that tension between capacity of the existing system and investing in new capability. And I think we'll have to wrestle with that as we move forward. Over.
Well, thank you, General. That was going to be my next question, but let me go to the follow-up. We've had a successful shoot down of an ICBM class warhead with an Aegis Navy standard missile. And now we have greater threats from North Korea, including what some people are seeing as a submarine launched capability. Iran has the largest missile force in the Middle East and has tested more missiles than anybody else in the Middle East. What should then the future of missile defense look like with the military writ large? Particularly, should the focus be land, sea, space, all three? And whose responsibilities organizationally should that be? Let's turn that over to General Todorov first, and I'll get back to you, General Formica.
Well, the answer, in my opinion, is obviously going to be yes. It's going to be all of those things. I will give you, I think, two words that, when we think about future construct and how you knit these capabilities, need to be at the forefront. One is distributed, and the other word I use is disaggregated. And that's got to include capabilities from space. We've yet to talk about that, but the time has come, the time has past come for us to really get serious about space sensing, about getting away from these large terrestrial-based sensors in the larger ballistic missile defense system. And we have the capability to do it from space. And that includes tracking and discrimination and, by the way, fire control, which is going to be a very important element to, I think, a future missile defense architecture, simply because of the speed at which the threats are going to be upon us, particularly a hypersonic threat, going to be maneuvering. It's not going to be something that a terrestrial-based sensor or a spy radar or an Army sensor of sort is going to solely be able to handle and deal with. And so this idea that it's distributed both from a sensing standpoint and from a shooting standpoint, and that means kinetic and non-kinetic, is extremely important, I think, to the future. And so I wanted to make sure, this idea of, a radar next to a VLS tube in a land situation somewhere is, I think, a bad idea. We've got to distribute the capabilities around, and we've got to disaggregate it as well to include space. The other thing I think I would mention vis-a-vis your question, the things that you mentioned, the shoot down standard missile of an ICBM target, great news, of course. And we want to incorporate those capabilities into the broader architecture, I think. But I think, as with many warfighting capabilities, layering is going to be extremely important. And how you layer capabilities, offensive, defensive, kinetic, non-kinetic, across a continuum of capabilities gives a sort of strength or defense in depth, if you will, for missile defense. And then you couple that with all those capabilities to something that General Formica has talked a lot about already in this offense-defense integration. It's not just solely a defensive capability. How do you really think about this architecture that knits it in a strike capability, in a long-range strike capability? And so when you put that together, I go back to the integration theme. How do you integrate the capabilities? How are they distributed? How are they disaggregated? How do you spread them across a continuum and the offense-defense? So I think I would take that question that way, Peter.
General Formica, over to you, sir.
Okay, so what he said, right? I mean, that was a pretty thoughtful response. I would say first, as Ken said, it is good news, and we would together congratulate the Missile Defense Agency and the United States Navy for such a successful intercept. It's just another in a series of strategically significant successes that the Missile Defense Agency has engineered over the last several years. What a terrific organization that brought and continues to bring real missile defense capabilities to our nation. I think the continued demonstration of increased capabilities of the SM-3, as Ken said, offers us more options as we go forward and consider how we're going to layer our missile defenses for the homeland and in the regions. GMD, Aegis, both at sea and ashore, THAAD and Patriot, future kinetic and directed energy or non-kinetic and directed energy capabilities, all provide options as we consider how to have robust defenses for both the homeland and for the regions, and taken into account in consideration with offensive strike capability. You asked about organizationally. That's a little bit more of a difficult subject and probably something that I'm sure is continues to be widely debated within those who are still in uniform. But from my perspective, I'm not sure that we don't have it about right. First of all, the focus of the Missile Defense Agency is the material developer, and retaining that responsibility and that which they do so well, while the services remain responsible to organize, man, train, and equip the functions for their air and missile defense capabilities. And I think we have that about right. In terms of the COCOMs, they have a responsibility to operationalize those capabilities in their areas of responsibility. And I don't see that changing. I think that we have that about right. And I remain, and I've said this before in this forum, but I remain an advocate for U.S. Strategic Command to remain the COCOM of global missile defense for two basic reasons. One, it's a global capability that spans all the regions, crosses geographic combatant command boundaries, and I think that that's an important consideration. And the second, it retains in one combatant command three very important capabilities: deterrence, global strike, and missile defense. And strategically, I think that remains very important.
Let me thank you, General Formica. General Todorov, let me turn to another question, and that is, the Mitchell Institute has been leading a lot of discussions with current air and space power leaders about the importance of what is called Joint All-Domain Command and Control, or JADC2. Can you tell us more about why it's so important to the broader missile defense enterprise with respect to JADC2?
Yeah, Peter, I'm glad you brought that topic up, and I'm glad that Mitchell Institute is focused on that this year, and I've enjoyed many of the conversations that you've had about that topic and vis-a-vis, the Air Force's contribution at ABMS and the other services, et cetera. JADC2 is much more than about missile defense, of course, but missile defense, I think, is a very important part of JADC2 and what it will become. And again, it's one of those, ask 1,000 people, get about 1,000 different definitions about what it really means. And now many are putting a C in front of the JADC2. So combined, talking about working this in concert with our close allies and partners on the world. That's extremely important because, as you know, if our nation gets into a conflict, that's how we're going to fight. So we can't do this again as a vacuum as a nation. But it's got to start certainly here at home. And I think it's got to, the importance of it, the question that you asked, is really first and foremost, go back to the threat environment, the pure competition environment that we will see, that we see today, is really at, I think all of us on the line would likely agree, it's a pretty significant challenge, a scale that we have never really seen before. We're said it already twice on this call, I think. We would be fighting, in essence, largely a mirror image of ourselves, defending against high-volume, multi-mode, multi-azimuth missile attacks, and also all the while in the midst of striking high-value sensitive targets from an offensive standpoint. So the importance of JADC2 is that it attempts, the vision of it attempts to link together these capabilities to have, for instance, an Air Force eye providing targeting for Army fires, for a space eye providing fire control for United States Navy long-range strike, for an Aegis platform at sea that may be Winchester out of ammo on its VLS tubes, but can call in a fire from a long-range Army fire or an Air Force fire from various different means or modes. That sort of vision is really, I think, what Joint All-Domain Command and Control is all about. It's easier said than done. It's got to, again, begin with an architectural framework. So we're not, I think, as a nation, can't just throw out all those capabilities and start anew. It's not some brand new concept or acquisition that's going to magically solve it all. But you got to be able to start to knit these capabilities together. It starts with an architectural framework, and that's where it begins. And you need to have buy-in from the interested parties. And again, back to something I've already said, it's good to hear the dialogue and the conversation amongst the services about this. I think the realization is there. I think technologically it's doable, and we've got to get sort of on with it now to include all the domains, again, to include space, and because it's a very important task, not only for missile defense, but for all of the spectrum and continuum of warfighting capabilities.
Thank you, General Todorov. General Formica, one other question I had with respect to procuring and fielding our systems here for home and abroad. What's the relationship there between the need to have interoperable systems for our allies? And could you comment, if you would, about the recent decision by Japan on the Aegis Ashore system?
Certainly. Thanks, Peter. By the way, just again to add to what Ken said on the JADC2, I'm not directly involved in all that, but I can't help but observe that in our themes of 2013, we talked about needing to better stitch Homeland defense in the regionals. And in order to do that, we needed to have an integrated command and control. Here we are in 2020. JADC2 may be that opportunity to really help us get after that. At a missile defense symposium a few weeks ago, the commander Northcom reinforced that notion. And so it seems to me that something that we ought to continue to pursue. And so I appreciate Ken's comments on JADC2 and the Mitchell Institute leading that discussion. You asked me about allies and interoperability. I can't help but notice that both the MDR of 2019 and the 2010 MDR that preceded it both prioritize the need for increased missile defense capabilities of and in concert with our allies and partners. They're consistent in that, encouraging allied investments in missile defenses, probably a little bit more so in 2019, but increased burden sharing, co-development, and co-production. The Japanese offer a great case in point, not only with their participation in the production of the SM-3 Block 2A, their fleet of Aegis BMD ships. And I think we should also recognize that not only the Japanese, but several other allies allow access to our missile defense capabilities by the placement of missile defense and missile warning sensors and radars on their soil, and in some cases, even intercept capabilities. So this notion of going forward together in concert with our allies is important. It's been codified in both of the two recent missile defense reviews. It's obviously consistent with the current national defense strategy. And so it remains important that we continue to grow our missile defense capability with our partners and with our allies. Now, interoperability of the systems is important as you do that. You just can't increase stovepipe, incompatible systems. That won't work. That won't really contribute to a coherent regional defense. So interoperability is important. Investing in common systems is important in order to have the real capability and truly increase capacity. There's challenges. We've been talking about this before, not the least of which are foreign disclosure and the issues associated with shared targeting and sensor data, and how do you control that, protect national interests at the same time that you increase allied cooperation and ensure interoperability. And I'd also note that sometimes national policies can become their own issues. I mean, we are all into sovereign nations, and sometimes national policies get in the way. I would submit, Peter, that's why war games and discussions like US Stratcom sponsored Nimble Titan, which is hosted by the JFCCIMD, opportunities like that and other international forums are so important, where allied and partner nations can come together in a non-threatening environment and have real substantive discussions about the topics of missile defense in those regions. And we've seen the advancement of discussions on missile defense in those forums between countries, even in advance of national recognitions of those discussions. So again, very, very important. I also would point out that one of the things that we continue to drive home during those is we learned that what we call regional missile defense for some allied and partner is homeland missile defense, and it's a strong mutual concern. You asked specifically about the Japanese decision on Aegis Ashore. Obviously, that's a national decision. I think there were both funding implications and some concerns of the risk to local communities. And again, that's something that nations have to decide if they're going to continue to protect. They have invested in Aegis BMD with their fleet of ships, and it'll be important that we continue to work with the Japanese to help improve not only their capacity, but as they continue to contribute to our regional capacity together. Over.
Thank you, General Todorov and General Formica. Excellent presentation. We're now going to go to the open session. Questions from the audience. You can participate using the Q&A raised hand on your screen and unmute your mic and state your name and affiliation for our guest and direct your questions. You can also submit a question in writing, and we have two questions. One is, how should we integrate the question of hypersonic speed weapons coming at us, as well as we have offense and defense in that respect? That's one of the questions. The other question from our colleague, the Voice of America, the Korean service, was what are our big gaps with respect to China? I think I'll start with Ken Todorov, if you could just address those two questions, and then I'll finish it with General Formica.
Well, for Mike Doobie and for Dong, who asked those questions, I appreciate the softballs. Thanks very much on those. Those are excellent ones. And I know General Formica, I would think, would have some thoughts on the organized in terms of the integrator for effective defense of hypersonic weapons across COCOM borders. And I hope General Doobie doesn't mind me calling him out. He's the former deputy commander of the United States Northern Command, and I served with him in Building 2 at Peterson Air Force Base, and tremendous leader, and really has remained on the forefront of missile defense thinking, both at the Missile Defense Agency, doing some work there, and in other parts of the nation. So, General Doobie, great to see you online. Thanks for your question. It's an excellent one, and I think it goes back to the change of the nature of the environment. You know, 5-6 years ago, when it really, I think that that in Building 2 at the Homeland Northcom headquarters, a lot of concern, of course, of the threats coming from rogue nations, and increasingly we saw and are seeing now hypersonic threats on the cruise missile threat to the homeland, which is more of a NORAD mission, but also a Northcom mission, of course. And so how do, as these weapons, particularly hypersonic, are crossing these seams across the globe, literally, who is in charge maybe of integrating the capabilities to deal with them? It's a vexing challenge, to be sure, and the speed of the challenge only exacerbates that problem, because now it's not X amount of minutes you have now to understand that the threat is being launched, to characterize it, to declare it a threat to the homeland, to get the national leaders to decide whether or not you're going to take action on it. These threats are going to pop up from 360 degrees and azimuths and everywhere and cross these seams very, very quickly. And so it's a challenging problem, and one that I know I'm sure the department is wrestling with. I think it goes back to the integration challenge, and how do we integrate the capabilities? It not only has to be the capabilities of the systems themselves, but the command and decision authority capabilities as well. So that's got to be part of the CJADC2, I guess, construct. It's not just offensive defense, it's also decision making, and how you get commanders at all levels the right information at the right time to make those decisions. I don't have all the right answers for that, of course, but it's an excellent question, and I think it's one that the department would be wise to think about going forward. With regard to Dong's question, again, a challenging one, and one that I'm probably not in a good position to answer, particularly on the nuclear weapon fielding, the second part of your question, Dong. But I will say that for all of Ken's view, all of our partners and allies around the world, certainly being a part of the conversation on CJADC2 is vitally important from the get-go, remembering that it's got to be an architecture first kind of approach and framework. And so good to be in those conversations early rather than trying to bolt on later on. And so I would encourage that, to be sure. Thanks for the questions.
General Formica.
I agree with Ken. I'm not sure that I've got all the answers. This notion of hypersonic weapons and other threats that cross COCOM capabilities, it's a difficult problem to solve. I know that they're dealing with it in uniform. This whole notion, as I indicated in my opening remarks, in 2013, we were talking about this, and before, right? As we were looking at how do you better knit together Homeland defense in the regions, cross AOR became an issue. We spent a lot of time, even when I was at JFCC IMD, thinking about the command and control and how do we best pass data from one COCOM to another and who best manages that. So I think that is an issue that needs to be dealt with. I'd already given my thoughts about why I think missile defense as a COCOM responsibility should remain with U.S. Stratcom. I don't know that that necessarily answers the question of whether they become the key integrator, but I do think that that's an important consideration. The other thing is, again, we were talking about hypersonics in 2013, and then we continued to do the research and development, but it's only been in the last few years where we've really accelerated not only our concern about our ability to defend against threat hypersonic missiles, but how does, that research and development in defense, how does that help our research and development in coming up with our own offensive hypersonic capabilities? And the one thing I'll note is the Missile Defense Agency, at least from the technology perspective, if you look at their BMD placemat, they've now added a gold squiggly line, which shows the path that a hypersonic weapon would take. And I think having the Missile Defense Agency fully invested in helping to understand the technology, develop the correct missile defense against a hypersonic, and to be able to provide that capability and integrate the technology among all of the varying agencies, I think that's a rightful place for them. And I think that's helpful that they're doing that. I think Ken answered the JADC2 part of Dong's question. I too am a little bit off base trying to talk to low yield nuclear weapons, but only to say that when I talk about offense defense integration, the use of the offensive capability and attack ops really is as much deterrence as it is the employment of those systems. And to the extent that that applies, I would offer that. Over.
First, great to see General Formica. We're a long ways from Afghanistan. And Ken, great to see you again. I'm Mike Boer, for those that are out online. I'm the Vice President, Air Force Strategic Account Executive at Leidos. And I actually have just a two-part question. One's to pull on the thread, Ken, that you mentioned about having an integrator in the Pentagon. And I'd ask, are you not seeing that leadership out of the Vice Chairman and the J6 CIO office that's been trying to actually been coordinating that effort across the services? So that would be one. And the second one that I'd open up to both is, where do you think C2BMC needs to evolve to dovetail into Joint All-Domain C2, given that was kind of a great strategic comms network, if you will, for missile defense anyway. And there's probably some synergies there that can help accelerate some capabilities on Joint All-Domain C2. Thank you.
Yeah, Mike, thanks, Mike, and good to see you on the line. And hope all is well. I'll take the second part first. So, certainly very familiar with what C2BMC, which is the command and control backbone that MDA has spent a lot of years, not only MDA, but others developing. It is absolutely a part of the future command and control architecture in my mind. Once again, I think it's important to know that, I don't think any of us should suggest we discard any of the really good capabilities that are out there. The question is, how do you build on them? And I think C2BMC is certainly a part of the future. And certainly I'm also familiar with it with my time at Northrop Grumman, who has a part in being the technical lead for the C2BMC program as well. So big fan. I think it is a part of the future missile defense certainly for years and years to come. I think there are some, C2BMC is designed to not do some things, particularly on the latency front, particularly on some of the fire control with sort of the more shorter ranges in the missile defense. I'll just call them umbrellas. And so I think that C2BMC with another architecture, like for instance the Army's IBCS or other architectures or capabilities are out there, are going to be again part of that knitted together, that melding of capabilities, but certainly not suggesting in any ways that goes away or something replaces it. There's too much riding on the C2BMC backbone for missile defense in particular that we would discard that. With regard to the integration architect, and again, I know there's some fine work going on, and not meaning to suggest that anyone in the establishment, the Pentagon, is not leading that way. I really think it's important, though, that whoever is empowered to do it is given some authorities to do it. And from my own experience on the Joint Staff, sometimes from the JCS realm, as you know, is sometimes tough to have those authorities and the budget to be able to do it. And you're more of a trying to lead and cajole from the middle. And so really giving someone, again, those authorities and to do that and to make some decisions, I think just a suggestion that should be considered. And I know going back to my time at JIAMDO, that organization really was in part designed to help kind of coordinate those efforts. But at the end of the day, whatever dollars were spent were up to each of the services, and that still remains to be true today. But it's a great couple of questions, Mike, and I appreciate the ask, and good to hear you on the line.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Did you want to?
I don't have anything really to add. I thought Ken's response on C2BMC and the integration with IBCS and how that needs to eventually integrate in with a more fully fleshed command and control system. I thought his answer was right on. But I did want to say hello. I saw your name on the list. You were one of those that I wanted to call out. It's good to see you, Bo.
Same here, and happy holidays to you all.
Thank you to you.
Well, with that, General Formica and General Todorov and our colleagues and friends who have joined us today, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. From all of us here at the Mitchell Institute, have a great aerospace kind of day, power kind of day, and be safe. Have a good holiday season. And we want to thank everybody who's online, who's been a supporter of our programs. We can't do it without you. And again, thank you, gentlemen, for a wonderful presentation. I want to thank my colleague, Camilla, who is a wizard when it comes to these, how to put these sessions on. Thank you. It's been wonderful. And again, thank you for our audience and our two speakers. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.